Welcome to the MENA Mix monthly recap, the Institute for Middle East Options monthly look at the region. Of course, a region that keeps rewriting the world's agenda. I'm Adel Hamaizia. I am the Managing Director at Highbridge Advisory and a non-resident fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School. I could not be more pleased about who is beside me for our very first episode together. That person is someone I saw in Bucharest, Romania, about a month ago, where we were discussing energy. It is the formidable Dr. Helima Croft, who is Global Head of Commodity Strategy at RBC Capital Markets. Helima truly is one of the world-leading voices on energy and commodities. We're very delighted to have you here. Helima, welcome. It's a genuine thrill.
Thank you so much for having me, and I am floored by your magnificent backdrop for this conversation.
It was just to impress you, but also because there's a military angle which we can discuss later. But before we do discuss sort of military munition, missiles, markets, and midterms, we want to start light, just to bring in some of our IMEO community, and to start with a little bit something light, something that's fun. Halima, admittedly, we are both hopeless football fans,
Huge
and
fans.
last month's World Cup, we didn't just watch it. I actually attended a match. I think you attended more than one. How many did you attend?
I attended four.
Okay, I'll compete with that and say I went to about six or seven and the final in 2022. So we can compete on that. But I didn't go to the final this time. Kind of happy because it wasn't great. Anyway, I want to sort of dive right in. Let me start right there. So which MENA side? I think we had 8 or 9 if you include Iran. So not just Arab region, but MENA. Which side gave you the most joy? And which match had you shouting rather than analyzing in your typical
So
in
I
your
would
typical way?
say it is one and the same. As a massive Mo Salah fan, obviously Egypt was my MENA team for the tournament.
Hmm.
And I continue to look back in anger at what happened in the Egypt Argentina game. And I break with Tarek Masood on this issue because he was out on LinkedIn saying, get over it, everyone. Egypt, focus on, what you can do better next time. I think it's very important to have sort of an autopsy on the VARs and like how they were used, who got favoritism, when they were deployed. Do we have a rules-based order when it comes to VARs? So
Wow. I like that.
Derek Masood,
Rules-based order.
I'm throwing down the gauntlet on this one. I'm not letting this one go. I was also upset by what happened, obviously, in the Argentina-Switzerland match as well. But Egypt was my heart of the tournament.
And so favorite player, Mo Salah, favorite team, Egypt, favorite moment more generally or performance.
So I have to say, like, what moment the World Cup gave me the most joy? I was at the quarterfinals, England, Norway. I went to school in the UK. My husband is from Iceland, but grew up in Norway. We had to sit apart at the quarterfinals because he was rooting for Norway. I was rooting for England. And I have to say, like, that was to me such a great match. But to sing Wonderwall with all the England fans at the end, that was a wonderful moment. And I
Amazing. Also,
love Jude Bellingham. I'm a Marcus
he's very
Rashford
good.
fan as well. So again, like
He's very,
I do love England.
he's very good. We'll ask IMEO to put on another episode on football where we'll hopefully be invited back. For me, very quickly, Morocco, I think, are now in the top 10 league. They really are among the
Yes.
best. So I think Ashraf Hakimi, Bunu, and of course, I forget his name, Bouadi, the midfielder, excellent. Mo
Yes.
Salah, excellent. The performance of the tournament, I think, from the MENA side was Hissam Hassan against Argentina, hashtag Vargentina. But we'll come back to that. Algeria, I
Oh,
think could have done much better. Riyad Mahrez, great. Ibrahim Mazza announcing himself on the stage. A question I have for you, and we're going to try and segue from soft power to hard power in just a sec. But I think just in 4 years' time, we've got, of course, Morocco as part of the World Cup hosting.
yes.
We have Saudi 2030. Could you speak to, do you think that the region's most effective, if you like, embassy, cheaper than and faster than any ministry, is football in terms of soft power or call it al dente power? Like, what do you think
I mean,
there?
I think it is a great investment for the young populations of the region. I mean, I've gone to some of the games in Saudi Arabia and
Hmm.
to see like young women like enthusiastically in the stadiums, like cheering for their teams. Like that is
Hmm.
just to me like it's a great moment. I think football brings people together. I think it is a great investment in terms of lifestyle, in terms of like leisure activities. So I think
Hmm.
it's a great investment. What I'm looking for though is are we going to start to see more local talent coming out of the academy? So
Yes.
when are we going to start to see the Al Nasser, Al Hilal academies produce like very talented young Saudi national players? So that's the next sort of like investment I'm looking for. It's not enough just to bring in great players from abroad. It's to see the academies actually generating homegrown talent.
Absolutely. So beyond the literal and metaphorical scaffolding for our conversation, we want soft infrastructure, not just the hard going
Yes.
forward. Absolutely. So that's, I think, exactly where the fun ends, I'm afraid, for
Yes.
this for the purposes of this discussion, though we'll try to spice things up somehow. But we'll speak to Vision 2030, particularly in the Kingdom in Saudi Arabia, being about diversification, digitalization, decarbonization. But of course, unfortunately, in recent months, including last month, we've been talking very much about drones, devastation, and dehumanization, rather. And if you want a little bit more, I think these R's that I think will maybe frame some of our conversation, which is this R word of resilience that we've been hearing nonstop in recent months, roots and recalibration. And because that's, I think, what everyone in the region is now chasing. So our running order, like I said, we'll be discussing missiles, markets, munitions, and midterms. And moving from this soft power to this hard power, let's jump in and sort of talk about talks and a war
Right.
seemingly without an off-ramp. So just to start with headlines. So headlines. Bloomberg, 3rd of August, yesterday, Iran says Hormuz talks are underway after Trump calls off strikes. Guess what? Reuters, same morning, Iran says there are no talks at all. When the two things that can't both be true are, we stop watching diplomacy, are we watching leverage? And if I could sort of jump right at you, and we've heard differences from Foreign Minister Aragchi from the Almani channel.
Yes.
We've heard about final stages. Today we heard about World War III. Could you sort of speak to, you've read Tehran for years. Is this a genuine opening, or is Iran just buying time between rounds? Is the US buying time? Where does this actually go from here in your sort of top line bluff, bottom line up front?
Yeah, I think the key question for energy markets is we have these sell-offs like clockwork whenever we get an announcement from administration officials in Washington saying the war is over soon. We get this sell-off. And the question I always ask is, how many ships are actually moving through Hormuz? And even if we get some type of like resurrection of the June MOU, which I really saw as a Rorschach test, everybody saw in that MOU what they wanted to see in that document. But even if we resurrect that and we get some type of interim agreement where Iran and Oman joint manage Hormuz, like, is that going to lead to the normalization of shipping traffic? If I am a tier one Western shipper, a Norwegian shipper, a Danish shipper, if I'm a Japanese shipper, am I okay now going through two ways? Am I going to exit and return as long as there's the ever-present threat of a resumption of missiles and mines, the whole issue about who's going to actually clear the mines in the middle passage of Hormuz? So I don't think it is the sort of final deal that winds the clock back to February 26th. But I would actually say I don't think we're ever going back to those levels of shipping traffic. But I think so many people in the market are so ready for this war to be over. They want to move on to discussing easier topics for them that they just seize on any headline signaling endgame. I call it optimism bias. Like anytime you get something that confirms that this has to be over, you just go with it, irrespective of asking, have we been here before? Like how many times could we have had this same conversation about, well, we're here, this is the end. Is it the end? And what does that mean?
Absolutely, absolutely. And just for those who maybe are not watching as closely, I think you'd have to have been hiding in a bunker. But after 28th of Feb, we're going to be talking about choke points. But of course, Iran subsequently closed Hormuz, fifth of the world's oil. It's LNG, helium, phosphates, all the rest of it. And we'll come back to some of the numbers proper. But just to sort of give you a little bit on, if you like, the last week of July or late July, Guard missiles hit US forces in Jordan. Iran struck bases in Kuwait. US and Saudi forces hit militia in Iraq. US CENTCOM said it struck dozens of IRG targets across Iran. And of course, a drone reached Egypt's Damietta port. We'll come back to that slightly. But I actually want to pick on you for one particular point, because I know you have a sort of global mandate, a global look, not a sort of Middle East myopic link like some of us, hashtag myself. But the wars, if we think about Russia, Ukraine, 4 or 5 years and counting and change, on 25th of July, I believe it was somebody's birthday, Ukraine did something new. Its drone struck an Iranian cargo ship in the
No,
Caspian Sea, the first direct link between the war in Ukraine and the war, if you like, in a sort of, brazen, in your
right.
face type of way, right? So I think Kiev's logic is simple. The vessel was ferrying drone and missile components from Iran to Russia. So an Iranian ship supplying Moscow could be deemed a legitimate target. Are we now seeing, in your opinion, two wars quietly merging, or is this just some tactics from Kiev?
I mean, the commingling of the conflict, you could make a case, given the role in terms of Russia supplying Iran with technology, the kind of two-way transfers when it comes to drone technology, that these conflicts have been linked from the beginning. But
Yes.
with Ukraine's attack on that Iranian vessel, it was a sort of most overt signal that we are going to potentially see a more active Ukrainian role. And I think it was designed to really pull at the heartstrings of Washington to say,
Yes.
you know what, we really do need the technology. We need more assistance with Patriot. We're fighting the good fight. We are
Yes.
basically defending, your position in the Middle East. So was it sort of a tactical play by Zelensky ahead of the visit to the White House to say, like, I support your agenda in the Middle East as well?
Yeah.
I think that potentially was an aspect of the Ukrainian decision to strike that vessel. And it had the risk, as you know, of setting off
Hmm.
like more escalation. I mean, the Iranians came out right away and said, like, we're
Yeah.
going to respond. There was a fatality in terms of that
Yes.
attack. And so there was then the diplomacy to sort of wind that down. But I
Hmm.
think we have to pay close attention as we go forward to any
Hmm.
more indications that we're dealing with kind of one theater as opposed to two.
Yeah. So if we sort of describe it as two theaters at the very least and one supply chain for some, like
Yeah.
if I was to ask Helima Croft to give us a headline for news articles tomorrow, is this becoming a single global energy war when you think about the two? And you can
Well,
throw in Bab and Mandeb.
I think what's very interesting is the tactics. And we talk about the volatility in terms of crude prices. Like we were up past $100 of Brent at one point in July. Now we're back down into the low 80s because of this optimism that we're going to get the deal done. But one of the challenges for President Trump is that we still have real shortages of refined products,
Yes.
gasoline,
Yes.
diesel, in part because there has been so much targeting in both conflicts of refineries. Think
Absolutely.
about what has been hit. Ruwais has been targeted in the UAE. We've had Al Zor targeted in Kuwait. We've had Jazan targeted recently by the Houthis. The
Yes.
systematic targeting of refineries has been a feature of the energy war
Absolutely.
component. And if we
Absolutely.
think about the Russia-Ukraine war, Ukraine has also been systematically targeting Russian refineries to the point at which we had a period where the Russians put out a ban on exports of refined products. Russia is like the second largest exporter of diesel. So we're
Yeah.
now in a situation because there have been so many attacks on refineries in both conflicts, it's stressing the ability of the rest of the world to supply the market. And so we now have US refineries running flat out. We don't have spare
Yeah.
capacity when it comes to refineries. Europe hasn't built a refinery in 50 years. And so
Yes.
if we were to get a hurricane, a serious hurricane in the Gulf Coast of the US, that would only add to the problems that we're seeing now when it comes to refined products. So I would say the story to watch over the next couple of weeks is what happens to the all important sort of diesel and gasoline markets.
Absolutely. So I think it's very clear. I mean, if we come back we'll come back to the energy point. I think if you bring sort of Washington, Tehran, of course, we're talking about a multiplayer game now, and those players are growing. But we're really, I think, in an escalation trap, right? Washington believes pressure yields concessions. Tehran believes disruption forces limits. And of course, you can read the others' pause, if you like, as proof of its own coercion working. So I think a pause, I think for many isn't peace, right? It's reloading in the words
I
of
think that
a
is
friend.
I think that is the great analysis of this, but I think is being missed by so many people who just read the Bloomberg headlines is a pause did not mean a definitive endgame situation. I mean, if
Yeah.
you are the US, all the headlines that we've seen on the munition shortages, the interceptor shortages, the long range missile shortages, like it is in Washington's interest to have a pause. If you're the Iranians, it is in your interest to have a pause on attacks on critical infrastructure and to be able to get in more
Yes.
food and vital supplies. So is this
Mm.
just the intermission? Or is
Yes.
this the closing act?
Absolutely. 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 No, absolutely. And I think, just for our non-energy observers, our non-military watchers, I think Iran clearly can't match America carrier for carrier. So, of course, it makes cost of US policy surface elsewhere. I always joke around about whack-a-mole, but sort of insurance, freight, Asian gas bills. I was reading just, I think, earlier today, I think NASA showed that 60% of Asia is dimmer if you compare pre-Feb
Please.
28 to now. So that cost contagion is being mirrored everywhere. And then that sort of other point, and I don't want to dwell on IR terms or military terms, but this mission creep, right? You start with one objective and it starts to expand. I think the war that began over centrifuges now, of course, defends Kuwait, Riyadh, Iraqi militias are involved, Egyptian ports, and each step is, I think, breeding the next. We just mentioned Russia, Ukraine. So just to sort of, and if I could sort of, I don't want to lead the witness and maybe just
Yeah.
a mini prelude,
Yeah.
but just this point around the Persian Gulf Strait Authority. This was before July,
Yeah.
but with I forget the term. My military lawyer, UNCLOS, United Nations Convention Law on the Sea, right? We've seen Suez man-made, Panama. There's Malacca. Of course, we can think about the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles. When we think about transit passage and customary international law, you know, is there real danger to this war not just what we're seeing right now, but the precedent it sets in terms of this toll booth discourse? Does every choke point state, quietly sort of
Right.
that, a strait is a revenue stream, hashtag Houthis or Yemen and Malacca, and we can go on and on.
Right. Does everybody now need an easy pass to go through the choke point? And who are you actually getting that easy pass from? I mean, one of the issues with Hormuz is that as long as the Iranian Revolutionary Guard is a sanctioned entity, I think it's going to be exceedingly challenging for, again, that kind of tier one Western shipper to pay the toll. Now they're trying to rebrand it as a service fee. But again, you have to get sign off from your compliance department to make that type of payment. So I don't think it's clear at all that you're going to have ease of payment when it comes to a certain category of the shipping industry. So let me
Yes.
just take 1 second. Sorry about that
Bless you.
coughing.
Bless you.
But I think that is going to be a barrier to normalization that's not being talked about enough is how much of this sanctions architecture remains in place and who can actually pay.
Absolutely, absolutely. And on this point on costs and balance sheets, and of course the reconstruction costs for Iran will be, immense. I mean, the
Enormous.
the decimation is incalculable. We heard about the War Secretary Peter Hegseth speak to the $37 billion cost. Most people think that it'd be significantly higher if you bring in the base damage. But in terms of the front that may decide it, is it fair to say that this might not be in Tehran, but thinking about the 3rd of November and that point on midterms that we sort of spoke to at the top of the hour? I think we saw Trump's approval ratings aren't where he'd like them to be. We've seen, if we go back to Clinton in 94, Obama 2010, and then if you look at Sabato's crystal ball, I think it favors the Democrats. I think at least my American friends will tell me that, flipping the House and the Senate map is sort of drifting that way too. And of course, tonight, I think it's tonight, right? We've got a bellwether in
Michigan.
Michigan. That's right. Could you maybe speak to any of those thoughts on how you see that?
Well, the interesting question is the damage already done in terms of, voter sentiment around the war? So even if we get some type of like off ramp, we get this deal where again the joint management between Iran and Oman of Hormuz, more ships moving through again. I don't think we're going back to pre-war levels. But is that enough to repair the damage to the Republican Party in advance of midterms? And again, this is why I also say pay close attention to the issue around shortages on refined products, diesel, gasoline that are going to persist regardless of what is signed, I think, in terms of like this interim agreement. So I think that's a really interesting question is how much of a dividend will the president get by signing an agreement that, again, he may not be the active participant right now because it looks like it's sort of an Omani Iran deal. But is there also a question of like, blowback from the finish the job camp in Washington as well. So we talk about sort of
Hmm.
US voter anger over this war and higher gasoline prices, but there also is a camp in Washington that is like, no, like finish this job. Like, you know
Yes,
what?
yes.
Like push forward, make sure that it's a different regime in place, because as long as Tehran has the ability to threaten above ground infrastructure. So we talk about new pipelines that might be built after this, but there'll have to
Hmm.
be pumping stations. There'll have to be a port at the end of that pipeline. And as
Absolutely.
long as you have that infrastructure exposed, the proponents of the finish the job camp will make the case. As long as Iran is there and you have this exposure, you're not going to de-risk this situation. So
Hmm.
better keep going and ensure that you have a different regime in place. I don't think that camp is a spent force at this point. So I would
Hmm.
also be watching what happens if this deal that's being talked about gets done. Can President Trump sell it to that constituency? And like
Absolutely.
obviously that's I think a position that's supported by Prime Minister Netanyahu as well.
Absolutely. I think it was earlier today or just yesterday, so which would be the 3rd of August, that I think Trump was speaking to oil firms are making, I think it was, quote, too much money, right? And if we follow the economics home, just to sort of link the US and the region, and I'm going to pick on the GCC states, if you follow the economics home, there's this sort of clean transmission line here, right? An oil spike feeds US inflation, which of course pins the Fed. Higher for longer means dearer mortgages, and of
Yeah.
course credit, right? And then if you look at things from the Gulf side, arguably, we saw these $1 trillion pledges last year when Trump visited the Gulf states once again,
Right.
trillions of dollars of pledges. But if these guys are focused on reconstruction, they're focused on their own air
Right.
defenses, where does this leave some of that petrodollar, which used to go to the US first and foremost,
I mean,
and
what are the
everybody else thereafter?
priorities? This is, I think, such a great question.
Mm.
And you think about it, I'm sitting in New York right now, and you have so many hedge funds and private equity that go to the Middle East seeking investment. And
Mm.
are they going to be able to be as successful in getting commitments right now, given the fact that you
Absolutely.
have these GCC states that have been heavily targeted? So let's think about Kuwait, for example,
Yes.
very flush sovereign wealth fund. What are the
Mm.
priorities of Kuwait going forward? You have to
Absolutely.
repair your airports. You have to repair the Social Security Administration building was
Absolutely.
targeted.
Absolutely.
Kuwait Petroleum
Absolutely.
Corporation headquarters were targeted. They have targeted your power infrastructure. They've targeted your desalination plants. Like there is a massive rebuild in the GCC that's going to be the primary focus of the leadership there. And what does that mean for ability to fund projects externally? I think there's going to
Absolutely.
be less cash. And I think that
Absolutely.
is something, there's going to be a bit of a reckoning in terms of what is available for investments outside the region. And I was talking to one of my favorite leaders in the region right when the initial MOU was signed. And he said to me, like, the idea that this country would contribute to the $300 billion reconstruction fund for Iran, he was questioning that. He said, my priority right now is to rebuild my own country and meet the needs of the young citizenry of my country, not to
Mm.
rebuild Iran right now. So again,
Absolutely.
I think these countries are going to be very, very focused on
Mm.
infrastructure repair. And I think the issue of water is something to pay
Abs-
very close attention to. I
Absolutely.
mean, I think that has caused a lot of anxiety, the attacks on desalination plants. And I've spoken to, when we were in Romania, one of my friends
Mm.
from the region said, like, it's an urgent priority of his government to get more days of cover when it comes to water supply.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think the water supply point maybe we'll try to bring into the next section or the section after because we've got some more headlines. And of course, there's the point around energy storage abroad as a form of bypass. But I just want to get a very quick sentence out of you, which is, I'm sitting in central London. So Churchill learned at the Dardanelles in 1915, so 111 years ago, what a narrow strait does to a grand strategy, right? So Gallipoli swallowed his plan and nearly his career. Of course, he came back in World War II. Is Hormuz this century's Dardanelles? And what would convince you? We were talking about de-escalation versus pausing. What would sort of, convince you that we're really talking about de-escalation? Would it be sustained transit, softer insurance, a sanctions move, or is it sort of a mix of all three and change?
I think it's a mix of all three and change. And I would add into that, are we getting back to some type of JCPOA 2.0? Like, where are we on the conflict that started the war? Are we any closer to solving issues around how many centrifuges can Iran have? What level can it enrich uranium at? What does it do to the stockpile of highly enriched uranium that we may or may not know the location of? Like those were the issues that triggered the 12-day war in June, that triggered this war that's now in its 6 month. Like we've now focused so narrowly on Hormuz, but like what about the initial cause of the conflict? So I'm watching progress towards a lasting agreement to the nuclear issue because that's the catalyst for where we are now. But again, on just on Hormuz, I think it's not just one-way traffic as well. I mean, you had ships that had been on the water with their crews for over 100 days. When that MOU was signed, the Versailles Treaty, when President Trump signed that, you had ships willing to exit. The question is like,
Yes.
are you willing to go back? How
Yeah.
many people who have been essentially, their ship has been evacuated, are willing to say, let me go back in there and let me deal with an uncertain security environment? Because as long as these core issues are unresolved, I think there's always the ever present risk of some spoiler saying, you know what, let's just fire off a few more missiles or drones. And we don't even know at this point who's going to clear the mines in that sort of central lane of Hormuz. So again, two-way transit for me when it just comes to energy flows is what I'm looking for.
Absolutely. So we want to transition, and we've been, naturally very much focused on the sort of big item of the of July. Let's try and sort of focus a little bit on the GCC now. I like to speak in alliterative terms. I'm told I have an affinity and addiction and an affliction for alliteration. But really, I think what we'd like to do is maybe think about the shield, the sword, and stagecraft, and I'll explain what I mean here. So if you take just the first fortnight, right, and now we're honing in on the GCC states. And I'm going to come to a photograph momentarily. But, Saudi Arabia went kinetic inside Iraq on 29th of July.
Yes.
This was PMU fighters. This was a retaliation for, I think, an attack on oil facilities. Of course, we saw the Houthis try to blockade Saudi Arabia, and then Saudi link shipping was hit. We saw, of course, I think it was just 4 or 5 days ago, 30th of July, Saudi Arabia convened, I think it was 43 of 51 invited states for a multinational maritime defense coalition. And this isn't sort of crafted as Saudi versus the Houthis, but a trading system versus, if you like, coercion at sea. And then finally, Damietta, which was mentioned just earlier. We saw Egyptian waters finally come in, not finally, but, perhaps unexpectedly come in. And this was the first strike, I think, since Feb. So before we sort of dive in, maybe could you just sort of speak to when a Gulf, or if you did GCC, gets pulled in like this, does the market read it as an escalation or as the region finally sort of owning its own defense, if you like?
I think what's interesting is, so I think the market is looking through all of this. Again, I think there's such a large segment of the market that believe this would be a short war, that it would be no longer than what we saw last June, at most 6 weeks. And so at this point, it's just so beaten down by the volatility in the market that they just don't even know how to price or interpret signs of expansion. And so I think there's a lot of market sentiment fatigue. That's why I keep saying the oil price is a broken barometer. Like, don't look to the oil price as an indication of the geopolitical risk building in the Middle East. I mean, I will look at what happened in Egypt and say, this is extremely worrying. This is their main port for LNG. The fact is that this comes after a number of ships decided not to traverse Bab el-Mandeb, but to basically take the longer route, through using the Sumed pipeline and going around the Cape of Good Hope. Like, is that a signal that nowhere is safe, that you cannot de-risk us? So I look at the Egypt attack and I say, wow, this is essentially closing down the alternative routes. It's to basically say you have no way out if we make that decision. But again, the market looks through that. But I see it as a very worrying expansion. And again, I go to the idea that even if we get some type of interim deal to have Iran sort of formalize its control rights over Hormuz, does that solve the Saudi Houthi part of this conflict now? Like, what will it take for the Houthis to stand down? Does it involve more a better deal from Saudi Arabia? Does it involve more access to the airport and the ports? Like, I would love to turn that on you, Adel. Like, how are you seeing the situation with the Saudis and the Houthis? Like, what's it going to take to sort of off ramp that portion of the conflict?
I think there's a lot going on there, and part of what we've seen, I think, which was interesting, and not to sort of dodge your question, but we saw this Potemkin embrace, right? It was just 2 weeks ago that Saudi Defense Minister Khalid bin Salman and the UAE's VP Sheikh Mansour bin Zayed, they were sort of in a photo together. It
Yeah.
was sort of
Great
heralded
casual
as
wear.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Very casual. They're sort of heralded as sort of biggest story in the Gulf, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the reality is that allies who are genuinely aligned don't instruct their press to stop reporting friction, right? And we hope that there is really a detente at these, troubled times. And I think more Saudi UAE cooperation can maybe sort of help ease some of this. I think there's a lot of back channeling with our Qatari friends, with Egypt, and I think there are of course direct channels between Saudi and their Houthi partners. But I think the friction is real still. I think to go back to the Saudi UAE point, we saw the Yemen bombing prior to Feb 28th. We saw the Emirati OPEC exit in May. And I think just in late June, there was this sort of Iranian asset unfreeze dispute, which was, I think, a little bit unnerving. But I think that there's a lot more to say on the sort of Houthi point. But I think there's a little bit of a wait and see right now.
Yeah.
So I think we have to sort of sort of put our foot on the brake before any big expectations. But I think this Bab el Mandeb point really, it's choke point squared, right? Is it 7-8 million barrels? So I
Yeah.
think that there's more to say there. But yeah, if I could just maybe come back to the sort of Iraq and Egypt point,
Yeah.
I think now, arguably deterrence is now, I think you could say, is going to be distributed. So maritime coalitions, mesh of national air defenses, these sort of security minilateralisms, if you like. And then Iraq specifically is now going to become both hinge and hostage. So this sovereign state that pays for
100%.
actions it can neither order nor control, right? So you're in this doom loop of strike, retaliation, backlash. And I think those funerals of 30th of July made that loop very visible, and we've heard threats coming out of Iraq. And then I think if you come to sort of the Egypt point, 12% of world trade, we mentioned these millions of barrels,
Yeah.
inflation, fuel spikes, really, really troubling, I think, going forward. So we hope that we can see some calm and respite, at least in one of these strangleholds. But I know we're sort of running a tad, and I know we've got a little bit of time left. So if I could just jump in, and maybe we'll try to be shorter, and I'd like to get through a few of our sort of big
Yeah. It's
headlines.
the lightning round now. Basically,
Exactly,
it's like, don't
exactly.
be so
So
long-winded. Let's go.
exactly. So I think I think it was 10 million barrels we spoke. I think last time we spoke,
Yeah.
that's off the market, right? So if Gulf oil isn't moving and the rest is hostage to a headline, how do you even model this market? And if you could also maybe just speak to where LNG is, right? And I looked just earlier on, Brent's at 79, $80. Like, why on earth? I
Yeah.
know you say don't look at it, but I mean, it is our benchmark, right?
It's our
Literally and
benchmark.
metaphorically, right?
So I think what's interesting is that we can talk about the sort of jawboning of the market, the constant statements that the war is over and that influences sentiment. But there is a reality of China it's the swing consumer. And
Yeah.
China made the decision to basically pare back imports by 4 to 5 million barrels a day. So that the relief I think that we see in prices, there is a real component to it on the physical markets because of
Mm.
Chinese behavior.
Yeah.
And the Chinese had built a large reserve of all commodities before the war. And that kind of prudent risk management, I think, has allowed them to make
Yeah.
these like big reductions in imports. I could argue there's an energy strategy component to it as well, because
Yeah.
they put up bans on product exports, but then waive
Mm.
them for certain countries like
Mm.
Philippines and Vietnam. They've had
Exactly.
territorial disputes with. So I think China is a big part of the story.
Yeah.
But
Absolutely.
you know,
Yeah.
but going forward on LNG, I mean, you can't have the largest LNG exporter in the world essentially locked in and not have that really
Yeah.
impact markets. I think we see it though in Asia, and I don't think it gets as much attention because Asia, particularly developing market Asia, is not as visible market as the US or Europe. But as we go into winter and you look at European storage levels, like they are below where they should be. And yes, Qatar LNG mainly supplies Asia, but there's the US LNG cargo market. And the 20% that's spot market, not long term contracted, Europe's going to have a challenge bidding that away from Asia if
Yeah.
Qatar LNG remains blocked. So I think we
Absolutely.
need to pay
And
very close
Helima,
attention. Yeah.
just on that point, just for our colleagues, just to sort of bring in a globalization of energy, if you like, because you mentioned it and you mentioned the US. The trains that were damaged in Ras Laffan in the Qatari facility,
Yeah.
they're partly offset now, right, by Golden Pass, the giant joint
Yes.
venture on the Texas, which is
Yes.
Qatari owned, right? So it's very kind of poetic almost in a kind of disturbing way.
No, I mean, it's the benefits of, energy investment outside your borders. And you've had, for example, the Saudis have been coming to the United States talking about investment in gas facilities in the United States. So gas has been the sort of
Yeah,
global gas market is fascinating to watch. But the
yeah,
molecule angle, though, we just can't escape because, again, we've had US exports to the rescue, but there's only so much that can go around. And if
yeah,
we don't have Qatar LNG back
yeah,
up and running, if the train isn't moving, to use that
yes,
expression,
yeah.
there's going to be competition for the US
Mm,
cargoes that are on the spot market. And so, again,
mm,
like if we have a colder winter in Europe,
mm.
when does that become a bit of a winter of discontent?
Absolutely. And I think just for our listeners and our colleagues and our friends, I think one idea is just to sort of bring it back to brass tacks. There is the paradox of the choke point, and I think Chris Wright and Dr. Sultan Al Jaber, Chris Wright, the Energy Secretary, and Dr. Jaber have both spoken to this, which is you get diminishing returns on this sort of chokehold, right? Because of the bypass thinking, even if almost everywhere is fair game. And we were just speaking to Babel Mendeb. And I think another point which is sort of interesting, and I'm just ticking a few boxes here because we want to cover the news. We saw
Mm.
Aramco profits surge, and I think it's very
Yes.
clear that not all GCC states and OPEC producers are born equal. And you mentioned Qatar and LNG in terms of the geography or cartography of energy, as it were. But we also had this incredible investment in Kuwait
Oh,
in wartime, right? How does one even try to explain a $16 billion confidence thumbs up to the region, right?
I think what's so interesting, and we talk about the Aramco investment, I think is one of the most important stories of this as well, because they invested in redundancy. I mean, they
Exactly.
made that, billions of dollars investing in the East West pipeline for a rainy day was contingency planning. And it is, along with like the reduction in Chinese demand, that investment has also helped stave off $200 oil. But the question going forward is, and we had this discussion when we were together in Bucharest, there is
Yes.
some skepticism that we're going to make investments in redundancies because there is a view of a large part of the market that it all worked out fine, that maybe
Yes.
we didn't need those additional 10 million barrels of oil a day, that the market just found a way. And who's going to green light investment in redundancy going forward? I think there's all this
Absolutely.
discussion right now about, oh, this pipeline is going to be built, this one's going to be built. But it's easier to build a pipeline in a country that controls the coastlines.
Absolutely.
Getting investment where you have to base with landlocked countries, countries that have to run a pipeline through another nation. You could talk about Turkey, all the issues we've seen with the
Yes.
ITP pipeline and the
Yep.
disputes between, Ankara, Baghdad, Erbil. Like these are not easy projects. Even if they're built, there are disputes over transit fees
Absolutely.
that can like keep
Absolutely.
flows down. So I think there's a lot of optimism that we're going to green light a lot of de-risking infrastructure.
Mm,
I'm more skeptical that the hard dollars are coming, especially because there's
mm.
so many people that think we just got through this just fine.
Yeah, I think not to sort of move too much away from oil, but I was saying to some friends, I was in New York at one of the big funds I'd like to say it was May or June. And I think in no other context outside of a region that has, several trillion dollars of sovereign wealth, would you see these commitments from international partners in wartime, right? But I wanted to touch on the ghost of 73. We don't have enough time. I wanted to touch on tanker wars and analogies and metaphors. You mentioned this sort of efficiency to resilience, this just in time to just in case. But on this point on energy, there was another big headline, and that was around Saudi nuclear cooperation, and by extension, Israel, Palestine, and the Abraham Accords. So you mentioned acts and theater earlier on. So if we look at Act 1, 22nd of July, just over 2 weeks ago, or roughly 2 weeks ago, the US announces a decades-long civil nuclear pact, right? With Saudi. Everybody's like, wow, finally, amazing, incredible. What have they left on the table for negotiation vis-a-vis Abraham Accords? Next day, Trump makes it totally subject, in his words, totally subject to Saudi joining the Accords, right? And then, of course, I think it was Caroline Levitt who said the deal would be off without normalization. So just very briefly, like in your words, and I'll share some perspectives, is this a real energy program or is this a bargaining chip dressed as something else or dressed as one?
Well, I think what's interesting is like always like read the fine print. And remember, like prior to October 7th, we were very close to like US Saudi grand bargain under the Biden administration.
Yeah.
And Abraham Accords were the essential ingredient to getting the US Saudi civilian nuclear program done.
Yeah.
And when I saw the announcement of the deal, I was like, well, wait a second, I can't imagine that we're not going to have a discussion within 24 hours on where we are in Abraham Accords, because that was so tied to the discussions under the Biden administration. And so it does not surprise me that it surfaced so quickly. And now the whole deal is in question.
Absolutely. So in the words of one of my colleagues who I won't name, he sort of describes it as 3 deals in one: energy, I'd scribbled it down, industry and order. So sort of the energy piece, of course, Saudi wants baseload power, desal, stop burning its own crude, and of course we've seen some headwinds there. But I think a third of its electricity from was it rather sell. So you've got the nuclear piece on the energy side. You've got the industrial piece, which is Washington sort of wanting to revive its nuclear export industry. We've seen Russia, China, South Korea with UAE previously, sort of generational contracts. And then I think the third piece is where the normalization, sort of security guarantees, this anti-Iran alignment, if you like, fused into one package. I think the really technical point is really about the enrichment piece, but we don't have enough time to cover that, so I'm going to come back to that.
That's
we can talk
whether
about
the program is dual use or not, 100%.
Exactly.
Like
Exactly. So we'll come back to that, and I think there'll be more discussions within the
there will be
IMEO
more
community.
Discussions on whether there will be an additional protocol to the deal.
Exactly, and I think there's
to use a proliferation terms.
Exactly, I think exactly. So I think so. Just to bring in Gaza briefly, because we've seen another big headline, and there's a very long list here. But I'll just sort of give you the top line, right? So start with whiplash. 30th of July, 4 or 5 days ago. Capitals, I think it was remind me, Trump Truth. Board of Peace had reached a historic agreement for this sort of complete disarmament of Hamas. And then, of course, in reality, we'd heard that Ghazi Hamad rather of Hamas said there'd be no disarmament before Israel withdraws. So again, there was vocabulary around heavy artillery or heavy weapons, heavy weapons versus softer weapons, and then of course, what are we talking about? These sort of 3 Ds of disarmament. So is this complete? Is it crisp? Is it a press release? And then demobilization, which is this sort of text bar fighters from the police. And where does that fit in? Detention, amnesty, what happens in terms of civilian life? And then I think the big one is whether we see this decommissioning. So who is the verifier? Who will watch the watchers? And I think if each side just keeps its capability as insurance, then you're in a deadlock and you're almost in a kind of, for lack of a better analogy right now, but a US-Iran, who goes first and, let's talk about talks. So I think that's one, I think, one thing to sort of think about. I don't know if you had any other thoughts on that. If not, we're going to go from the Eastern Med and run to the Western Med in our final.
In our final minute, let's make that sprint.
Final minutes. Okay. So, so I think the big one, of course, I think it was on all of our TV channels the last few days. We were speaking about it, and we actually can link it to the World Cup through Pedro Sanchez, who attended the Spain World Cup winning final when Lamine Yamal, who hadn't scored a goal, and Mr. Prime Minister traveling to Algeria.
Though. Let's be clear.
Yeah, exactly. Traveling to Algeria, which provoked perhaps Morocco in some way, shape, or form. Yes. That's what we see circulating. But the short version is that there is a Spanish enclave of Ceuta, which gave way on the 30th of July. The border was breached. Some 60,000 people crossed in 24 hours. To a territory of 80,000 people. So almost like for like, crazy stuff, right? By 1st of August, I think we'd seen 67 were dead. And of course, this was also partly provoked by disinformation online. The idea was that these young men who, want jobs. I used to say in the old days, our colleagues, starting with Sarkozy back in 2011 of the Deauville Partnership, they would speak to money, markets, mobility, when in fact, it was all about migration, right? So I think there's sort of a few quick points here, right? Number one, the first read is you've got this sort of permissive coercion. So a lot of my interlocutors, I was speaking to a friend in Morocco just earlier, this surge came barely 10 days after Sanchez visited Algiers. Questions about what that looks like. Is this messaging? The second piece is if you follow the gas. So this only makes sense inside a sort of a trap Spain's been in for years between migration and energy. We had a pipeline between Spain and Algeria that transited through Morocco. There's one direct. So there are two. One has been decommissioned. The contract wasn't renewed some years ago, tied into the Western Sahara dispute, tied into the Abraham Accords. And then, of course, in terms of a third point, Europe's single needle, right? So we saw this become a huge furore in Europe. I think you were in Europe at the time. Meloni demanded that Spain be suspended from Schengen. Ridiculous. Ceuta was not in Schengen, right? So there's a lot to say there. There's all sort of conspiracies that brought in US and Congress and I think, Senate, and brought in Israel, right? Given Spain's support for Palestine and Gaza. That also takes us, if I may, in our last few minutes, next door. One of the two winners, if you like, at least economically, of the war, according to the fund, the IMF, Algeria and Libya. Do you have any points on that? Algeria recently had elections as well.
Well, I mean, I think you're the expert on the Algerian elections, but I do think that the benefits of the war are to the countries that have been able to continue to export through this crisis. And so if you are Libya, if you are Algeria, and you are not impacted by this crisis, you are receiving the economic dividends of the higher oil price. But it's interesting, we think about a country like Kazakhstan, and Kazakhstan has been, I follow OPEC very closely, they've been problematic in the OPEC plus relationship. And now Kazakhstan is also a victim because of what continues to happen with Russia, Ukraine. And so countries that we would have thought would have been beneficiaries, they have also seen problems because of the other war as well. So again, Libya, Algeria, they benefit in terms of revenue. But it's interesting in terms of the inter-OPEC plus dynamics. Kazakhstan has been deeply problematic in terms of compliance levels. And now they have been effectively forced into OPEC compliance on production because of the Russia-Ukraine war.
Absolutely. So just on the Algeria point, and by the way, those are two massive countries with, I think, similar size, if I remember correctly. But so, yeah, it was 2nd of July. So the FLN, the ruling party since independence, they won the most seats again. It was 90 odd of 407. But the story, I think, isn't the party, it was the turnout, right? So there was some 21% at home, which is, I think, the lowest in Algeria's sort of independent history, under 11% abroad for diaspora like myself. So the headline isn't sort of, I think, who entered parliament, it's those who didn't. So I think 3 quick points. Abstention can be deemed as political behavior. We call it apathy, and it becomes a non-participation issue, which is a challenge that has to be, I think, addressed. The second, I think, is that the participation wasn't diverse enough. There were some boycotts. There were some that had boycotted and may now face disillusion in terms of the party. So that's a challenge. And then I think one thing which is a kind of, I don't want to use Pyrrhic victory as a in this context, but lack of a better metaphor, is that the executive has become the center of gravity. And of course, that means energy, the Sahel, Morocco, Western Sahara. And we've seen what could be described as this, if you like, rentier reprieve, because the war reached Algiers directly. How? Sonatrach, I think, on the very first day of the war, had an LNG cargo go to Germany, I think at Wilhelmshaven, and we saw a lot. One of the challenges in Algeria, 100 BCM, give or take, production. It consumes almost half. And of course, without arresting through energy consumption, through pricing reforms, and maybe some sort of citizens account a la Saudi Arabia, where you have cash transfers or similar, you're going to have this issue where, every molecule that could go to Europe is actually being spent on air conditioning in Oran or Algiers. So these I think are big challenges, right? So I think one question is really maybe an open question for another conversation is Europe's scramble for Algerian gas. How much of a durable advantage is this long term? And then, if I may, we'll go again back to the Eastern Med. It was 10 years on the 15th of July, and I know we've got to wrap up. You tell me if we have a couple of extra minutes, just so we can bring this to a close. But it was Turkey, which on the 15th of July, 2026, had its 10-year anniversary or commemoration of the coup, where I think over 250 had died. Did you have any thoughts on that, or?
Again, I think this is more of a topic, Adel, I'd love your views on. Again, I've covered Turkey from the energy component angle, but I would love to hear your thoughts on what this means at the 10-year anniversary.
I think, Turkey generally above my pay scale, but I think if there's 3 points, if you like, I think it's that during the past 10 years, I think we've seen civilian control become truly presidential, and the military's role became sort of, from autonomous guardian has sort of diminished, right? So there's this sort of civilianization removes military tutelage, for lack of a better description. And then I think one thing that you see in more centralized states, the state gets faster but narrower, and of course mobilizing quickly. I can go into the inflation issues which we've seen that have actually been improving in recent years. And I think the sort of final legacy is this, if you like, strategic autonomy as doctrine. And I don't want to say Plato to NATO, but you have NATO balanced against Russia. We had Turkey with Qatar in that period. We had Syria, Libya, Iraq. And now, after the toppling of Assad, just coming up to 2 years, 18 months ago, now we have, of course, a friendly government under Shara, and Turkey wants to sort of benefit as this sort of hinge state. Of course, there are growing issues with Israel, Europe always sort of frenemy-ish, sometimes friendly, sometimes not. And then, of course, how it plays its geography, I think, will be key. But if you go back a century, I think if you look at the sort of founder and heir, Mustafa Ataturk, who has a statue in Bucharest just near the hotel our conference was in, he built the republic and I think left the army as its self-appointed guardian. But I think friends now would argue that Erdogan spent this past decade or so ensuring that those guardians never guard again. So I think that would be sort of the final point. And then I think in this last minute, if you have, is just this point on sorry?
Can I bring in a point though? Actually, because I do have a Turkey point. Listening to you brought me back to a Turkey point that I think runs through these conflicts. And maybe it's a cautionary tale point on Turkey.
Yeah.
Is that you talked about the funds in New York that are all, bowled up on investing in infrastructure in the region. I would say a lot of funds in New York go to the region looking for capital.
Yeah.
And I do think like it's important to sort of think about like how many, are these countries going to have to self-fund a lot of these projects? I think that's really important. I think there's going to be more self-funding than Western capital necessarily going into a lot of these projects. And then I would say about de-risking infrastructure. Again, if you have to cross national boundaries, it can be a lot more challenging. And I bring this point up all the time on ITP. I mean, think about all the issues we've had about this pipeline that runs from northern Iraq to the port in Ceyhan, and the constant sort of three-way dispute over revenue, over control rights. And I see that as cautionary for everybody who's like super excited about the new Iraq, Syria project.
Yes.
I always think if you have to have that transit agreement, you're putting in another level of risk to the operations going forward. And again, I look at that Turkey pipeline and I say, we should have been at maximum capacity for years on that pipeline. And we have had so many periodic problems when it comes to flows.
Absolutely. And if we can sort of wrap up, because you mentioned it, and it did come up and it is so key. Syria was in the news every day for the wrong reasons. Now it's been more positive, right? You mentioned Turkey. In fact, there's this Banias pipeline which comes up, and that's again maybe for a separate discussion. But just to sort of wrap, and I'm going to ask you for three things that we should be thinking about in the next month and in the period ahead. But could you maybe just speak to, has the Iran war made these corridors? You hear about IMEC, Iraq Development Road, of course, BRI, you hear about less so. We heard about just last month, which brings in the headline, this Hijaz Railway of yesteryear. If you remember, T.E. Lawrence blew it up. Now are we going to, over 100 years ago, are we now going to be thinking about what its infrastructure looks like? And of course, there's always this geoeconomic or political economy, winners and losers. Any thoughts on maps being easy, but markets being hard, as I like to sort of frame this?
Again, I think there's a lot of optimism that we can easily build this de-risking infrastructure. And the fact that, we've had the big Chevron announcements on Syria as well. You have had a number of US companies get very excited about Syria. And so again, I think that is a sort of optimistic story when people say what is the shiny, bright new object in the region.
Exactly.
There's so much optimism around Syria. And I'm listening to the podcast, we call her Emma, about Asma Assad that The Observer has done. And it's sort of amazing when you listen to that, to think about we're in this moment where there's just so much optimism that this country is the key to solving these issues. And again, I'm still in a watch and wait, but I can't deny that, a number of companies have been very excited about potentially operating there.
Absolutely. So usually when I talk about C's, I always have C's in my pocket. So competitiveness, coordination, communication, connectivity. But I think when you're thinking about corridors, or what I've been describing as with friends, corridorization, I think you've got these five C's, and they're quite important. First of all, cargo. So where do the anchor shippers and real volumes look like? We've seen the Emiratis have been quite active. Latakia Tartus. Capital. So who's going to absorb the construction? Political risk can throw in FX, insurance, customs. So not only tariffs but non-tariffs, right? How can they cross quickly digitally? And then of course control. So who secures the route and settles disputes? So these I think are big questions. And then that final one, which speaks to I think the broader GCC, broader MENA, is continuity. So if you're funding redundancy, and this is one of the questions I have around pipelines, and beyond, if commercial financing, values and infrastructure assets through throughput and all the metrics that are very clear, how do you price, optionality? And one of the things I've been thinking about beyond Sukuk or a regional resilience fund, or if we have IOCs and some of the New York funds in your vicinity who can maybe contribute to things like this if they're part of a business case, is I'm asking myself, wait a minute, and I've been asking myself this question, I want to write something about this. And it's, if hydrocarbons underwrite the very large defense bills in our region, should the defense budgets also underwrite some of the hydrocarbon and other infrastructure? So this is maybe something to ponder and for us to think about. But I think if we could just wrap up and I could ask you maybe 2 or 3 things that we should be thinking about in the coming period, and then we'll start to say goodbye au revoir to our listeners.
I would just say, going back to like my sort of core competency, that we should be really looking to how does this war end? And what act as a play are we in at this point? And it does deeply matter. We're getting to points where we are drawing down, commercial inventories to levels that we have not seen in decades. We are getting to points where strategic reserves globally are getting drawn down to people questioning, are we at sort of operational minimums? So I don't think this dance can go on forever in terms of the supply outages without it really impacting the consumer. And so the question is like, how much runway do we have to continue to lose 8 to 10 million barrels a day from the Middle East without seeing real problems in terms of shortages in some markets or just price in others? And beyond that, I'm watching for, you brought up UAE's exit from OPEC. We continue to have these OPEC meetings where they announce that they will be bringing back production. Like timelines for actually being able to really meet these commitments, I think are going to be important. Like we simply do not know the scale of the damage. We can look at satellite imagery and say, this is the above ground damage. We don't really know what's beyond, what's subsurface in terms of damage. I think there's going to be varying restart timelines. You brought up Iraq. There are reports that Iraq is offering to pay a pretty significant premium because they don't have their own tanker fleet to be able to move these barrels. Like who can bring back barrels fast is going to be a really interesting thing to watch. So I think it's going to be very staggered restart times again, but that means we have to get to end game, and I'm not sure we're there yet.
Absolutely. I won't try to supplement or complement too much, but I think for me it's really, on this mediator point or words versus water, will the Oman Channel, I think, produce this actual sustained passage through Hormuz, or will markets again learn that truth social moves faster than a single tanker, right? And then I think this point on ballots, bullets, and barrels, I think the role of the November midterms, we've got other elections like Morocco, which are interesting for other reasons. And then, of course, I think this point on redundancy versus rhetoric. So we're talking about July disruption and Kuwait's vote of confidence, but I always talk about how do you move MOUs into bankability? So those are a few things I'll be watching out for in the coming period. Final kind of notable mentions. One, we saw the death of the father emir of Qatar, Sheikh Hamad bin Khalifa, who died in July. And then, of course, I think one of his legacies is turning the Sleepy Peninsula at the time into an LNG superpower, and we're seeing the impacts of that today. Of course, Al Jazeera, the World Cup, and you can go on and on. We saw Senator Lindsey Graham pass away. We also saw, who was always very engaged with the Middle East, We didn't touch Lebanon and Israel, and I'm sure colleagues will maybe touch on this next month. And then there was also a very interesting change at the Egyptian parliament level, where we saw some economic powers to the military-linked Future of Egypt Authority sort of move under presidential control. So there are question marks on what this means for decision-making and the economics of Egypt. So to sort of finalize our goodbyes and our thank yous, I think one big thing is security, economic architecture remain extremely intertwined. Corridors are coalitions, ports are policy, pipelines are power, as Helima would put it. And I think these bullets, and barrels, I think now move as one. And this grammar of commerce is, I think, written in this syntax of security. So, very much looking forward to, a more peaceful region in the period ahead, but maybe I shouldn't hold my breath. Helima, I have to thank you, as always, for incredible input, insights, and great football analysis, as well as all the serious stuff. And to everyone listening, we'll see you next time for the August MENA Mix monthly roundup. But just before we do that, one final sentence. Who will win the Premier League in the UK? I know it's not connected. We've got a lot of Middle Eastern players here. Who do you think will win the Premier League next year?
Oh, gosh. Am I going to go out there with saying Man City? Am I going to see that potential return to the top without Pep Guardiola? That's who I'm watching.
They have at least, I think, 2 or 3 players from the region, so that's a good punt, and I think I'm going to follow you. On that note, I'd like to thank everybody at IMEO, and looking forward to another August monthly roundup on MENA Mix. Thanks very much. Goodbye.
Thank you.